See that tank behind me right there? That's a UNS 60U, and I moved it all the way from Portland, Oregon down to San Diego, California. That's about 1,000 miles. In today's video, I'm gonna walk you through the story of how and why I moved it so far, and then we're gonna talk about how I planted this Iwagumi. This is, in my humble opinion, some of my finest work, and I'm so excited for the future of this tank. If you're at all interested in how I hardscape this tank and what technology and equipment I'm using for it, go ahead and check out the previous videos in this tank's playlist. Those will be in the playlist section of my channel, and they'll also be linked down below in the video description. So let's get started. So if you watched my video about where I had been for the last part of summer, I made a big move from Portland, Oregon down to San Diego for a big promotion. I work in video, photo, and editing, and I took a director position at the startup that I work for. So I initially set up the hardscape and all of this equipment as my last tank in Portland, and I was just at the point where I'd completed my dark start and I was ready to plant, and I was so excited, and that's when I found out I was making the big move down to SoCal. So I was a little bit devastated because I had really loved the hardscape I set up. I'd done my first ever dark start and I was ready to test the results. So what I did was I disassembled the tank and I took all of the stone, dried out the soil, packed that up, shipped it down here, and of course brought all the equipment with me. So I recreated the hardscape several weeks ago. I essentially just worked off of a picture of hardscape 1.0 and did my best to recreate it and just sort of optimize the angles of everything correctly. So after I put out my dark start video, I did get a lot of questions, and some of the questions show me that not everybody fully understands the concept of a dark start. For example, some folks ask me about adding fertilizer, other folks ask me if they should add CO2, other folks ask me if they could run a dark start and then do a dry start after that. And these things don't really work with the dark start because you don't have any plants, so you wouldn't need fertilizer, you wouldn't need CO2. And if you were to run a dark start where your tank is completely submerged and underwater and then drain it, plant it, and run a dry start, you would completely defeat the purpose of the dark start. So just to reiterate and get everybody on the same page, the dark start method is primarily utilized to leach ammonia out of your soil so that you can get through those delicate first couple weeks and avoid those daily water changes. Additionally, and arguably even more importantly, it is used to establish beneficial bacteria, because if you just flood your tank on day one and plant everything, there's always a risk of things going kind of wonky. So the dark start is designed to help minimize this and reduce water changes. So I hope that clears anything up, but hey, my channel is here for the simplest of questions. No such thing as a stupid question. Feel free to reach out if you have any more questions about the dark start. So I ran another one here, and once the dark start was complete, it was time to plant. And that's when I reached out to Buce Plant. I gotta give them a huge shout out for sponsoring this video. They provided all of the plants for me. And for this tank, I used about 30 tissue culture pots. So I'm a big fan of tissue culture because they're sterile. They're guaranteed to be snail-free, pest-free, algae-free. So you're essentially starting with the best quality plant as possible. In addition to that, while they look really small compared to their submerged plant counterparts, they're actually packed really, really dense. So if you're on a tight budget, you can really divvy up your tissue culture pots and plant on a pretty tight budget and cover a lot of soil. That said, with my YouTube channel, I try and cover as much soil as possible on day one for maximum impact so that I can put out good visually appealing videos. So that's what I did here. So let me walk you through the planting, what plants I used, and how and why I put each plant where. So for the first time with this tank, I actually decided to start in the midground. And this is a tip I think I've seen from my buddy Yuri's, but I wanted to lay down some of the highlights first. And in this tank, which is essentially a classic Iwagumi with a lot of greenery, I'm really gonna have my highlights be textural in the midground of the tank. So I wanted to kind of lay those down to see what space I was left working with. So for the midground, I'm using a combination of two plants. So the larger textured plant that went in first is the Helanthum tenellum, and I've kept this plant before. I love it so much, can't recommend it enough. It's probably one of the easiest plants I've ever kept before, and it's sort of like a medium-sized grassy plant. So when you think of like an Eleocharis, which is a hair grass, that's a really fine texture. The Helanthum is a thicker blade, but the cool thing is it stays really compact, and that blade is not so thick that you couldn't use it in, say, a nano aquarium. So I planted that very close to the rocks and sort of outlined little aspects. And then the next plant I'm using is the Eleocharis bellum to transition us from that thicker Holanthium plant to the foreground, which I will reveal what plant I'm using for that in a second. So I use that Eleocharis to sort of feather us out of that thicker texture and bring us to the foreground. And I was really curious to try a foreground plant that I don't have a ton of experience with. So I chose Glossostigma. When I was doing some research into how I wanted to plant the tank, I looked up classic Iwagumis, of course came up with the beautiful work of the ADA crew. And they use Glosso in a lot of their tanks. So I've only planted it once, and it was right before a move out of New York to the West Coast. So didn't really get to see it to its full potential, but I remember liking it. So I've got 10 pots of that, and that is what is filling up the foreground. So as you can see, we're gonna have a really nice textural transition that takes us from the foreground to the midground. A lot of beginners, and I myself make this mistake a lot of the time, really fail compositionally when we neglect the midground and we neglect a nice transition. You really never want like a flat lawn and then a tall background. You want some interesting transitions. So I think with these really big prominent stones and the ability to kind of outline them and soften up their corners, I was able to do that. As for the background, of course I wanted something a bit taller and I wanted to keep that kind of grassy blade look. So I went with Uncus repens. This plant I do have a decent amount of experience with. I planted it in my previous UNS 60U iteration and I was super happy with it. Now my warning with Uncus repens is it can get out of control and it doesn't just grow straight up. It sort of like spawns these plantlets, almost like a hydra. So you have to stay on top of trimming it, and if you neglect it, it can certainly get out of control quickly. But with this Iwagumi, I definitely want to keep it nicely trimmed and manicured to sort of preserve that classic Amano look. So I'm gonna have no problem with that. And with the planting complete, it was time to get the tank through the next few weeks. And for once, after undergoing the dark start, in theory, I should not have to do those daily water changes on week 1. So I'm gonna be experimenting with that. As of the recording of this video, the tank has been flooded for exactly 1 week and things are looking really good. For CO2, previously in Portland, I had set it up for inline, but I decided to transition to an in-tank diffuser just for visibility and to minimize any sort of leaking. Eventually, I'm gonna be grabbing a diffuser that goes lower in the tank, but for now, I've got this short AQUARIO Neo Tiny diffuser, and I gotta say, these are my absolute favorite diffusers on the market. You can grab them on the Buce Plant website. I'll link them down below in the description, but they're so discreet and they create the absolute smallest bubbles I've ever seen. So there you have it. This tank is all set up, and in theory, I should be able to add fish immediately because it underwent that dark start and it's already cycled. That said, you know, I call this still the red zone of an aquarium's life cycle when you first set it up. We're still prone to plant melt, we're still prone to an algae bloom, and dealing with those things with lots of fauna in your tank is never ideal. That said, I already have lots of great ideas for fish. Let me know down below in the comments how you would stock this. Of course, with this classic Iwagumi look, I'm going with a school of something. I got a great recommendation so far of black neon tetras, and I'm really curious. If you think that's a good choice, let me know down below in the comments. If you have other choices, let me know about those too. Thank you so much for watching. As always, my name is Logan with Logan Rando Aquascaping, and I'll catch you guys and gals next time.